Right. I say thank you very much to the previous speaker. I thought that was a fascinating start to today's webinar. I hope that I can inspire people to take radical action as well. But I would like to focus today on the role that internal insight teams play, corporate researchers, as Kristen referred to them, but also insight analysts, desk researchers, competitor insight professionals, anybody who works on the inside of a large corporate organization and uses insight of whatever type in order to try to drive big decisions within their organization. And I want to focus on that group of professionals today and think about that aspect of our industry, because it seems to me that with all the developments that Kristen spoke about in big data, all the changes in market research, all the new sources of information that are available to companies, both because of the way in which customers are increasingly interacting with organizations digitally, but also more and more conversations are becoming recorded on social media and other platforms, that customer insight is getting to the point where it really ought to be an organization's most valuable asset and a source of real competitive advantage for those organizations that can harness it well. However, unlike most resources, insight, information, intelligence only has any value if it's actually used. And I think we can probably all relate to the cartoon on the left-hand side of your screens there, where I'm afraid too many executives within large organizations, too many senior decision makers do have a habit of telling insight teams that they know exactly what they're going to do with their work. And unfortunately, it's not always take full notice of it and act on the recommendations. I think it's a truism, but perhaps one that we don't dwell on sufficiently within insight, that there is really no point in doing any research or analysis unless it does ultimately drive decisions. So at the Insight Management Academy, which is the best practice organisation for client-side insight teams based in the UK, but working with organisations in North America, Europe, the UK and beyond, we talk about insight as being any information which can ultimately make a difference. And insight management we see as the science and art of actually making that information make a difference. Now, what we've observed over the course of the last decade or so is that there has been a real shift in some progressive insight leaders' views in this field. And the most progressive, I believe, really do recognise that they need to take their organisations on a journey from seeing insight as being a service provider, very often within marketing functions, but sometimes as part of strategy functions or product or channel management functions. Take their insight function on a journey from being a service provider to being seen as a strategic asset. But it's difficult to do that, to go on any sort of journey successfully, if you don't have a roadmap to aid you in your journey. Any journey needs a clear destination, it needs a clear understanding of where you're starting from, and it needs some sort of a route sketched out between the two. So at the Insight Management Academy, we've been talking to a lot of our corporate clients over the course of the last 12 months to understand more about what they feel that journey ought to look like. And having understood the key principles, we've begun to build a roadmap. Our roadmap has 8 territories, which we think that progressive insight leaders within their organisation should explore. And those 8 territories in turn break down into 32 different areas. I'm not going to try to take you through all the 32 areas today, but I'm going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of the 8 territories that we look at. I'm also going to say something very briefly about the relative level of strength that the corporate leaders that we speak to believe that they have in the different territories, because having identified the Insight roadmap, the Insight Management Academy has now turned this into a benchmarking framework, and the 77 organisations worldwide that have taken part in this so far have provided us with lots of data to understand the current state of affairs. So here we go, here's the whistle-stop tour. So the first 2 territories that I'd like insight leaders to think about are the territories that we call insight generation and insight knowledge. Now, insight generation might seem like a pretty obvious place to start. In fact, there might be many people around the business world that consider insight generation to be the one and only function of insight departments. So I'll come on to why we don't think that in a moment. But there's no getting away from the fact that unless a market research team internally, an analysis team, a competitor intelligence team, a desk research team, whatever the label that you put on it, unless that insight function can actually produce new insights about customer behavior, their impact on customer value, and the key drivers that sit behind that customer behavior, then it's going to have a fairly short-lived future. At the IMA, we focus on areas like nailing the business issue, on coming up with joined up creative approaches to then going away and doing the research or the analysis, being agnostic about data sources, picking the best one for the job in hand, rather than compartmentalizing insight and thinking as market research activity as discrete from customer analysis. We also think about the role that insight plays in proactively coming up with solutions to business issues, not just coming up with an answer to a research question, but coming up with a solution to the business issue, which hopefully they've nailed at the very start of the process. Having generated insight, however, we think that at least as valuable an activity, if not more, is the whole process of building and then managing and utilizing insight knowledge. So the IMA describes insight generation, so the focus on insights as individual pieces of understanding, being quite different from a focus on insight, i.e. the collective understanding that's built from lots and lots of individual insights, built from various pieces of research and analysis into key customer segments, product users, and channel users over a period of time. In an organization of any size and an insight function of any degree of sophistication, the collective value that ought to exist within that accumulated knowledge will far outstrip the value that exists in any one new piece of research or analysis. And yet, ironically, insight teams are not really set up in order to harvest the value that exists there. On the Insight Management Academy's benchmark, teams average a score of 6.8 on insight generation at the moment, out of a maximum of 12, but only 4.9 on the whole area of insight knowledge. But that degree of progress is still good compared with their progress on other areas. So let's have a look at the next two territories that the Insight Roadmap explores. Another truism of insight, I think, is that a good insight badly communicated will always gain less traction within an organization than a reasonable insight brilliantly communicated. The market research and analysis purists amongst us might wish that that wasn't the case, but anybody who spent any time in a corporate environment knows that the way in which information is disseminated, knowledge communicated, usually has far more to do with the success of its adoption than the brilliance of the idea that sits behind it. So when it comes to insight influence and insight communication, the IMA makes a distinction between the work that insight teams do to influence identified stakeholders to explicitly take particular decisions that they know that their work is going to inform, versus insight communication, which we see as a broader activity, broadcast insight, if you like, which has to focus on having a communication plan, identifying different audiences, identifying different content, and identifying different channels in much the way that a news media organization might. Ultimately, the aim with insight influence is to achieve as much impact as possible with big decisions. With insight communication, it's more about trying to drive up the hygiene level of customers and their behavior and the reasons for that behavior in diverse parts of the organization, such that ultimately an insight team can have impact on a whole range of decisions which it didn't even know were being taken. So those four territories, generation, knowledge, influence, and communication, between them describe most of the work which an insight team will do on a day-to-day basis. But it doesn't describe in totality all the work which an insight leader has to do in order to really create an effective and professional insight function within their organization. The next two territories to look at are insight people and insight positioning. Insight people is one of those areas that insight leaders tend to score a little bit more highly. So they give us an average score of 5.8 out of 12, whereas insight positioning has a relatively low score of 4.9 out of 12. As people, it focuses on insight leaders, it focuses on the extent to which they have to be entrepreneurial in their outlook, as well as being professional managers and capable technicians. It also looks at teams and the way that insight team members work together. Very many insight teams, even in very sophisticated companies, tend to be set up in such a way that one particular researcher or one particular analyst is working on a job. And that's not an effective way of organising any corporate activity. Collective brain power, discussions are always important. Team meetings to discuss insight not only help insight teams to form a common view of key customer groups and their behaviour, but they're also critical to the actual development of new insights about those groups in the first place. Insight people also have to focus on the structure of insight teams and making sure that insight leaders take a dynamic approach to structure, always trying to maximise the effectiveness of the resources that they have, and of course the skill sets of the professionals that they recruit and develop. But no amount of focus on getting good people to focus on insight can make up for a poor positioning of the overall insight function in a corporation. Insight positioning is about establishing the optimal role and perspective of insight, both in the minds and the processes of the rest of the organisation. Insight teams, whether they think about them or not, have internal brands. People think that they stand for something. They have a view of insight as a concept and a view of an insight team in particular. But very few insight leaders actually pay much attention to that. Ironically, given they spend all their time researching the organization's market and trying to understand the environment within which the organization is trying to communicate, they spend relatively little time trying to understand their own organization and people's perceptions of the insight team, which of course have a big influence on how any communications that they do are received. But insight positioning is also about thinking about decision-making processes, the organization's decision-making processes, which will exist and which will operate regardless of whether the insight team recognize them and play a role in them. But the most successful teams have managed to identify the way in which organizations take decisions and to insert themselves at key points in those decision-making processes and then re-engineer their workload so it can have maximum effect at critical moments and thus have as much influence as possible. Finally, I'd like to talk about insight strategy and insight commerciality. Insight strategy, the average score there on the Insight Management Academy's benchmark is 5.2 out of 12. Insight commerciality, however, is the lowest state of development across all the territories, with the average score only being 3.6 out of 12 at this moment. So insight strategy focuses on the strange fact that relatively few insight functions in large companies actually have a written insight strategy, which seems strange if the assertion at the top of this paper that insight ought to be one of an organization's key strategic assets is anything like true. Insight functions tend to exist as a legacy of decisions made by other departments at other moments in time. They tend not to have had any sort of real forensic analysis undertaken to determine what role an insight team ought to play in its company, bearing in mind its company's position within its outside market. Without that understanding, you cannot possibly identify the most appropriate role for insight to play in actually moving the organization forward strategically. And that involves really hard choices about what the insight function will get involved in and what it will not get involved in. Issues of scope, scale, resources, the nature of its output, which things it delegates to other parts of an organization, which things it delegates to third-party suppliers, including market research organizations, and which things are too important to delegate and which it must manage in-house. Finally, however, all this strategy work, the positioning, the generation of new insights and the communication of them has to take place in a rather different environment to that which it often takes place in at the moment to be effective. Insight teams are not, by nature, usually terribly commercial in their outlook, even in organizations which are very much set up in order to achieve as much profit as possible. Insight teams need a really good understanding of core statistics. They need to understand the stats relating to revenue, to costs, to customer value, to segment value, to the big drivers of value in terms of customer behavior. And building on that understanding, they have to construct a model so that every piece of insight which is subsequently undertaken enhances their understanding of how the entire customer business franchise operates. That then enables them to prioritize work, to contextualize new findings, and ultimately to try to put a value on their own work. Remarkably few insight teams actually calculate a return on insight investment for their organizations, a practice which is commonplace in much of marketing, but is almost unheard of within insight functions. So to conclude, I would like to challenge everybody on the call, everybody who's either working directly for a client-side insight team, or maybe as a market researcher in an agency at the moment, deals day-to-day with client-side insight people. I'd like to challenge you to think more about how an organization ought to invest in its insight capability, not just in terms of new pieces of research or analysis, but in terms of the strength of the team itself in its ability to influence the rest of the organization in making decisions, which is the ultimate purpose of insight in the first place. In particular, I'd like to encourage you to think about what your destination ought to look like for increased effectiveness, what the roadmap might look like to help you to get there, and to check out your current location if you don't know what it is at the moment. In other words, compare yourselves with other insight functions to understand your strengths and weaknesses. That sort of investment in insight doesn't necessarily need to cost a lot of money. In fact, it can start by costing nothing whatsoever. The IMA habitually provides free insight benchmarking for client-side insight teams. It provides free content in the form of 5-minute insight articles. And for organizations which are keen on membership but need to make the business case for that investment in their companies, we're also willing to talk about free 6-month trials on a limited basis. So thank you for your time today. I hope that that's been interesting, and I hope that it's sparked your interest in trying to do more in this area. Thank you.